Hi there, folks. How are you all doing? My name is Eddie Ludlow. I'm the founder of the Whisky Lounge and a big whiskey lover. And I'm here today to talk to you about our World Whisky tasting pack. So my hope is that you have your said World Whisky tasting pack in front of you, ready to go. And we're going to get started with the tasting very shortly. Now, just before we do, and perhaps while you get yourself gathered together, I'm just going to quickly take you through the whiskey making process, just in case there's anybody out there who isn't familiar with it or would just like a little refresh. Now, this here is malted barley. This is the magic stuff, the stuff that we really need to make whiskey, single malt whiskey with particularly. Now, this is the point at which most distilleries get started. There are one or two distilleries that can do the malting on site, but most nowadays buy their malted barley from industrial maltings who are, to be honest, much better set up for the scale of operations required for the amount of malted barley required for most distilleries. Now, the distillery will have a mill on site, generally speaking, and the mill will grind the barley down into a grist, which is here. It looks like Alpen, essentially allowing access to the material inside the seed. This grist is then flushed with hot water of varying levels of heat, increasing levels of heat, and this essentially flushes the sugars out of the grist and creates this sugary watery solution called wort, which is essential to the process. It's the beginning of the process, if you like. Now, to the wort, we add yeast and we kickstart fermentation. Now, fermentation basically describes the conversion of sugar into alcohol. And for our purposes, we're looking for between 7 and 9% alcohol. And the yeast will do that from 48 hours to 100 plus hours, depending on the distillery involved. It will also generate some CO2 and a bit of heat, but it's the alcohol that we're mainly concerned with. Now, in a brewery, this would now be called a beer. In a distillery, it tends to be called a wash. Now, we take the wash, which obviously at 7 or 9% alcohol is still not strong enough to be called whiskey, and we have to distill it, which is obviously the major difference between a distillery and a brewery. So to do this, we take a giant copper kettle called a still, and we pour the beer or the wash into the bottom of the still. We then heat the still from underneath, boil up the liquid, and the magic starts to happen from there. So essentially, alcohol has a much lower boiling point than water, for example, and therefore alcohol vapor separates from the liquid and starts to travel up the still, having contact with the copper, which is contributing to a purifying effect. It then reaches the top, crosses over onto the line arm, and then hits the condenser. Now, the condenser contains cold water and therefore will recondense the vapor back into a liquid. And at this point, the alcohol level is around 25% ABV. Now, again, this isn't strong enough to be called whiskey, and we tend to call this material low wines. And to be honest, it's probably one of the least tasty products in the distillery. So fortunately, it's not something that's bottled very often, certainly not for commercial use. We then take the low wines and we distill again in the second set of stills, in the spirit still, and we take it up, this time to around 65 or 70% ABV. Now, we don't use all of the liquid in the spirit still run, because much of it at the beginning, so the 4 shots, and at the end of that particular run, the feints will be undesirable and quite harmful in some cases. So we reserve the feints and the 4 shots, put them into the feints receiver, and we keep them for the next run. Will actually be added to the next set of low wines to be distilled in the spirit still. So this middle cut that we've now selected, or the heart of the spirit, if you like, if you're a little bit more romantic, is generally of much more pure quality than the feints and the 4 shots, certainly should be, and is what we want to start looking at for maturation. Before we do that, we tend to reduce down to 63.5% ABV, and then put it into the cask of choice, whether that be ex-bourbon, ex-sherry, etc., etc. Okay. There are a couple of other elements in the whiskey making process. So here we have some peat. Peat is generally burned, and the smoke that is released by burning of the peat contains phenols which wrap their way around the barley as it's drying and create that smoky medicinal flavor. And we have got one or two whiskies on today which do have an element of this process. And then we have the casks themselves, and here you can see this is a cask stave from an ex-bourbon hogshead. You can see the char level there, and it's this char layer within the inside of the cask that really provides the magic of maturation. So it has a dual effect. So it's actually giving flavor whilst also converting some of the less savory flavors that you might find in new make spirit. Okay, good. Let's get started on the whiskey itself then. So you should have these whiskies in their order. As you can see behind me, I have in the order that they should be in the pack. Now, the first whiskey we're going to taste is from Hinch, which is an Irish whiskey. Just going to pour myself a little bit. Don't want to get carried away, do I? Now, Hinch is a new distillery in Ireland. Now, that might sound a bit obvious because there are lots and lots of new distilleries in Ireland. I've got a few slides to share with you as we go through this tasting. So I'm going to share this with you just now. So here you can see a map of the world showing all 6 of the distilleries that we're going to be tasting today. Now, the first of these is Hinch, and now you should be able to see a map of Ireland with lots and lots of dots on it. Now, if you go back about 10, 15 years, there would have only been 3 dots on that map because there were only 3 operating distilleries, which would be Bushmills in the north in Antrim, Cooley in the south close to the border on the southeast, and then Jameson right down in the south. Nowadays, we're talking multiple distilleries, which is great news because the Irish whiskey industry has suffered through the years. It certainly hasn't done as well as the Scotch whiskey industry, but is undergoing a massive revival, which is great news. I mean, in fact, at the moment, whiskey making is at a real high, or on a real high. So it's a really good time to be a whiskey lover. So we must rejoice this. Now, Hinch, as we'll see in a second, was only actually finished construction last year. I went to the distillery actually this year to have a look around. And thoroughly impressed with the setup there, but it does mean that they haven't actually distilled any liquid yet. Well, they have actually started distilling liquid, but it obviously is not ready for consumption. So they, in common with many other Irish distillers, or new Irish distillers anyway, will buy casks of whiskey from the other established distilleries and bottle it under their own label, which is what this 5-year-old Hinch is. So this is a 5-year-old blended Irish whiskey, actually from the Cooley distillery, but bottled under the Hinch name. Now, as I say, this is a perfectly common practice, and it does result in some very tasty liquids, but sometimes maybe a little bit of confusion because a lot of people will see the Hinch label and think, well, okay, that was distilled at the Hinch distillery. It will be eventually, but they need something to keep themselves occupied with in the meantime. And as I say, it's a very common practice Most of the new Irish distillers and brands will have at some point bottled from other Irish distilleries. But anyway, so you can see from the slide there that the plans are that they will use the 3 stills that they have using a triple distillation method. I described a double distillation method earlier on. A third distillation will simply add more purification and more alcohol. So it'll take it from, say 70% up to around 85% ABV, which will then still then be reduced down probably to around 63.5% ABV. But it just means that you're stripping out more impurities and you end up with something extremely light and very fine. So it should be cracking stuff, and the stills themselves are absolutely beautiful. They're going to be using a combination of mainly ex-bourbon, ex-sherry and wine casks, which is pretty common, to be honest, and I'm sure there will be 1 or 2 other things in there as well. Let's just come out of that slide for now. Now this 5-year-old blend, this is, as I say, from the Cooley distillery. It's only around 40 quid, so it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, and it's actually very tasty. Now, one other thing I was going to say to you earlier on is, apart from the glasses, you might want to get yourself a bit of water to use to add to the whiskies. Now, it's not mandatory, you don't have to do it, but I like to do it particularly for these tastings because it helps me just get to the bones, to the real sort of DNA of each whiskey. Adding water obviously dilutes the alcohol, so it helps your palate, but it also breaks apart and allows access to flavors which are otherwise locked in by the alcohol within the whiskey. Obviously, alcohol and whiskey are synonymous, so you don't want to get rid of all of the alcohol because part of the flavor is dependent on the alcohol, but there is a balance to be had. Now, in terms of what kind of whiskey you should use, we're currently using Larkfire whiskey for water, which is bottled from Scottish water from the very far north, and to be honest, you could use most spring waters because what we're looking for really is just purity, as simple as it may sound. We don't necessarily want mineral water. Mineral water, as it sounds, contains minerals, which can equal flavor, which can equal adding flavor to your whiskey, which is not the point of this. The point of this is to add something which is going to enhance, not necessarily influence. So I'm going to add a few drops of the water. You could use tap water if you live in an area where the tap water is okay, but all tap water is tampered with essentially in order to make it safe to drink, and therefore, quite often you'll find, particularly in the bigger cities, the tap water is pretty rank, to be honest, and you don't want to add that to your whiskey that you've spent money on, good money on. Anyway, so let's give this a little nose. Now, I might come out with some phrases and flavors and things that you may disagree with, or you may think, what on earth is he on about? That's absolutely fine. It's something I've become comfortable with because I've been doing this for some time now. But equally, I understand if you just want to enjoy the whiskey, you don't need to necessarily think about tasting notes and so on. So within this, for me anyway, I get kind of very light, appley, maybe baked apples. Yeah, definitely a little bit of pastry in there, sweet crust pastry. There's definitely a bit of citrus as well, so maybe a bit of lemon and lime. Now I'm going to give this a taste. There's a very nice balance to it. Actually, for me, on the palate, it tastes, even better than it smells. It smelled good, but it didn't have the depth that it has on the palate. It's got a really nice long finish to it, but it's definitely got aspects of what we smelled. So things like the baked apple pie, citrus, but there's also quite a bit of spice. I mean, for a 5-year-old blended Irish whiskey, it's got a lot of complexity, which is very nice, in fact. So that's the Hinched Double Wood 5-year-old. Now we're going to move on from Ireland to Wales, and Wales is single malt whiskey Penderyn. Now there are plans for more distilleries, and there is another distillery which is operating, which I don't think has whiskey to bottle yet. So Penderyn at the moment is the only game in town as far as Welsh whiskey is concerned. And a very interesting distillery is was down there a few years ago. I need to go back again. So lovely people, and very, very interesting, like I say, in that the still that they use is not the same as other distilleries. And I'm going to show you what I mean by this. Just bear with me a second. Let's just get a map up first. So, don't we all love technology? There we go. So you should be able to see that. So that's the map of Wales showing where Penderyn is, which is in the South Wales, right on the sort of Brecon Beacons National Park. So it's in a beautiful location. It's right in the village of Penderyn, and it's very much part of the community. And staunchly Welsh, quite understandably, is very proud to have the distillery there, and they've done extremely well, not just in Wales, not just in the UK, but globally. Created a globally recognized brand now, which is amazing considering the size of it and so on. So here we can see some images of the distillery. I like the kind of wooden exterior. It's really nice, and when you drive up to it, it's quite unassuming. You kind of don't realize until you get in there, when you see on the right hand side, exactly what's waiting for you. And it's quite a complicated facility at Penderyn. They have what they call a Faraday still, which is essentially almost like a hybrid still, so works on the principle of copper pot still distillation, but with some aspects of column distillation or continuous distillation. So it's quite a unique style of spirit that comes off the still. But again, they use quite a wide variety of casks. So ex-bourbon, ex-sherry, wine casks, but things like peated quarter casks. So they do a Penderyn peated, which doesn't mean they use any peated barley in the mix, but they do use casks that previously held peated whiskies to mature the unpeated Penderyn into, and it has this influence on the final whiskey. However, what we're going to taste is the portwood. So this is full portwood maturation, and bottled at 46%, I believe. That's a wee bit of that. Now, 46% is another kind of another talking point, as it were. Now, if you see a whiskey bottled at 46%, a lot of people who perhaps not into whiskey would think, well, okay, it's not as good. It's stronger than the normal, the average minimum of 40%. But why 46%? That seems like quite specific, and it is quite specific because it is the point at which a whiskey that has not been chill filtered can be it's the minimum alcohol level at which that bottle can be bottled, in order that it doesn't throw a haze in the bottle. Now, chill filtering is a process essentially developed to combat cloudiness of whiskey, and to increase the clarity of the whiskey at all alcohol levels, and particularly 40%. So if you chill filter the whiskey, you can bottle it at the minimum of 40% and not worry about this this haze being thrown in the bottle. Whereas if you don't chill filter it, then you run the risk, particularly at colder temperatures, of the whiskey literally going cloudy in the bottle. It doesn't taste any different. It just looks very, very different. Now, a lot of people feel that when you chill filter, you're actually stripping out something from the whiskey. Now, flavor-wise, it almost certainly has no impact. It's more to do with the texture of the whiskey, so how it feels when it goes down your throat. So the way to do it really is to taste a non-chill filtered whiskey next to a chill filtered whiskey. Now, the hint that we tasted before most certainly is chill filtered, 43%, whereas the Penderyn is unchill filtered. So it might actually be a good opportunity for you to be able to do that yourselves. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give this a little taste at full strength to begin with. I'll give it a nose first, obviously. And this, I get nice kind of almost cocktail cherries soaked in alcohol. Okay, so without water, it's very soft. You know, it's extremely easygoing. I'm going to have to pour myself a tiny bit more. I didn't pour myself enough to begin with. But really quite delicate, quite unassuming. It's not a very forward whiskey. Add a little bit of water this time. Okay, so the water really brings out a great deal of character in this Penderyn portwood. Start to be able to actually smell the barley, the raw ingredient, which I think is really important. And certainly from many people's perspectives, regardless of the oak used, you should always be able to taste the distillate character from each distillery, so that you get, you know, otherwise there's no point. You might as well drink whiskey from anywhere. And each distillery has its own individual characteristics, so these should be kind of proudly on display. Really fruity now, almost kind of herbal as well. Some nettles and herb garden. A lot more spice and grip on the palate. I would have to say, and you know, this does happen from time to time with water and whiskey, that water will have almost transformative effect on the whiskey. And certainly for me, with that Penderyn, I found the whiskey without water not particularly interesting. Maybe my palate's dead today or something, I don't know, but there was nothing in there that really kind of caught my imagination. But with the addition of just a few drops of water, it's absolutely transformed it into something that's really interesting and very tasty indeed. What do you think? I mean, the main thing here is that that you get as much out of this as possible, and I think you should definitely give that a try if you haven't already. I'm going to give that another taste. Very nice. Okay, so we're on to our third whiskey now. So we're going to talk about the Mackmyra, which is our Swedish whiskey for the day. Now, I'll just quickly bring up the presentation so you can see whereabouts the Mackmyra distillery is in relation to Sweden. And you can see it's kind of northwest of Stockholm, almost maybe sort of just to the south of the middle of the country. Now, Mackmyra, it feels like Mackmyra has been around forever. Certainly, I remember when they were first released. But as you can see, they were established by a group of whiskey-loving friends. Essentially, they went on a ski trip in 2002, and each one of them brought a bottle of single malt, and they all got to talking about whiskey and why isn't whiskey being made in Sweden? And it was literally during that holiday that they just decided, okay, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a whiskey distillery in Sweden, and that was 2002. They then, much as they loved the old distillery, they decided to build a really like a technological marvel in 2011. This Gravity distillery, which is the distillery that now produces what we're tasting here, for example. And I haven't been myself, but I've seen lots and lots of photos and presentations, and you can see it there on the left-hand side. It's this incredible 7-story building in which the processes within, whilst being very traditional still, are being fed and powered in a lot of cases just literally by gravity, which apparently saves around 45% of the energy they would use in the old distillery, which is quite remarkable, really. Aside from that, as I say, it's a very traditional method of production. Obviously, because they're in Sweden, not in Scotland or England or wherever, they're going to use local resource in order to create something that's unique to Sweden. So, for example, rather than using peat to smoke the whiskey, they'll use local flora, so local plants or trees that will give off a certain smoky flavor to the barley, but not in the same way that peat would. So when you get a smoked Mackmyra whiskey, it's quite different to a smoky Islay whiskey, for example. And also the use of Swedish oak, which is quite different to American oak and Southern European oak. So all these things contribute to what Mackmyra tastes like. And it does taste quite different to Scotch whiskey, but that's surely to be celebrated, because we don't necessarily want Scotch whiskey made in Sweden. We want Swedish whiskey made in Sweden. Let's pull myself up a bit. So this bottling is called Jatlika or Jatlika. This is it here. It retails at around, I think, 55 quid. I always love the labels of the Mackmyra, very almost very sort of absolute vodka design type thing. Not that I would drink vodka, by the way, but it's more about the flavors in the bottle. They could put it in a paper bag for all I care, as long as the whiskey itself is good. So this whiskey has been billed as a kind of autumnal series, so you'll probably see this being bottled once a year from now on. That would be the hope. Let's just get rid of that a second. And this contains whiskies that have been matured in pretty much every type of cask they have at the distillery. So ex-bourbon, virgin oak, sherry, etc. But also Swedish casks which have been filled with Loganberry wines from the local winery and then emptied, and then the whiskey filled into those. So you've got this kind of Loganberry influence as well. But let's give it a I mean, you can see the color, which is certainly not been added to, is quite deep. yeah, when you smell it, you get that kind of sweet berry aroma coming out of it. Almost slightly like strawberry Hubba Bubba or something, chewing bubble gum. And this is what I think most Mac Mirrors are bottled at 46.1%. 46.1%. Yep. Let's give this a. I mean, the oak is really to the fore. If you like an oaky whiskey, then this is certainly for you, I would say. Yeah, I mean, you can see why you would term it an autumnal whiskey. It's got lots of rich berry and spicy fruit flavors, which are really warming and comforting almost. I'm going to add a little bit of water to mine. Let's just calmed it down a little bit. Strip back some of the oakier flavors as you'd hope the water would. Bring you back to the distillate character. Okay. What do you prefer for that one, with or without water? I think it's good to add the water to it to get to the distillate character. But I think that I actually prefer it without water, just for the pure intensity and flamboyancy of it. I mean, I think this is a pretty crazy whiskey, to be honest. It's certainly not of the norm. It's a really interesting, vibrant whiskey, and again, that's to be applauded. I like tasting whiskies like this purely because they're so different to anything else. Definitely with water, you've got a more restrained, complex experience. And actually, I think it's a kind of whiskey of two tales. So perhaps at some points in the year or the evening, you might prefer it without water, whereas in other points of the evening, during the day, you might prefer it with water. So I don't think there's a right or wrong there at all. Hats off, really good stuff. Okay, so we're going to move to our Japanese whiskey that we have on here. I'm going to just get this onto the right slide for this. Okay, so here we have the map of Japan, and Yuichi. If you look all the way up here to the north, you can see it on the North Island of Hokkaido, and Yuichi on the western fringes of Hokkaido. Okay, so just while I pour this, I'll tell you a bit about Yuichi. So Yuichi was founded by one of the godfathers of Japanese whiskey. So some of you may have heard this tale before, but that's okay. I'm sure you don't mind hearing it again. But essentially, a guy called Masataka Takatsuru, who traveled to Scotland in the early part of the 20th century. He did so because he was sent there, albeit he really wanted to go. So Masataka was born to a sake making family, and then went to work for another sake producer. And the chap who employed him was very interested in Masataka's enthusiasm for whiskey making and the idea for making whiskey in Japan. And so Masataka talked him into sending him to Scotland to learn about whiskey making in order to bring that knowledge back to Japan. And that's exactly what he did. Via the USA, he got to Scotland and set about working at various distilleries in Scotland. So Speyside distilleries like Longmorn. He spent quite a bit of time in Campbelltown, as well as at university in Glasgow. And on top of that, he managed to meet himself a very fine woman called Rita, who he then married, and they went hand in hand back to Japan with and he then he got back home to Japan, and he found that the guy who had employed him, his business had fallen on rockier times, and therefore wasn't interested anymore in creating or building a whiskey distillery. So he was introduced to Shinjiro Tori, who did have the money and the wherewithal to build a distillery. And he, upon meeting Masataka, thought, okay, well, I've got the means to do it, and this guy knows how to do it, so let's get this happening. And so together they built the Yamazaki distillery, which opened in 1923. So we're going to be celebrating its 100th year anniversary in just a couple of years' time. It's incredible, really. And the two of them started making, well, Masataka would be the whiskey maker, making very good single malt whiskey. But all along, Masataka had wanted to build the distillery on the North Island of Hokkaido, because he felt that the topography, the climate, everything was much more in keeping with Scotland, and therefore he felt that the whiskey that they would produce there would be much more authentic and potentially of better quality. But obviously Shinjiro had the money, so he was the ultimate decision maker, and so Yamazaki was built on the South Island, much more centrally. So when it came time for Masataka to strike out on his own, and essentially the two of them, it would seem, had a big falling out, to which to this day the two companies don't tend to talk about. So Shinjiro was basically Suntory. So Suntory, which owns Yamazaki, Hakushu, the Hibiki blends, and so on. Whereas Masataka was Nika, the Nika whiskey company. So that's Yuichi that we're going to taste in a minute, and Miyagi Kyo, along with Nika blends. So Masataka basically upped sticks and went off to Hokkaido and built Yuichi in 1939, and was very much happier for having done it. And Yuichi is kind of a dedication, a monument to traditional whiskey making, including some of the only coal-fired, direct-fired stills left in the world. Most stills these days have an internal coil, steam coil, like a kettle, whereas stills back in the day would all have been direct fired by, initially by a fire, by a coal fire. So it's very much dedicated to that very traditional way of making whiskey, including the use of peat and peated barley. So when we nose this for the first time at full strength, I'm hoping you'll start to detect a bit of that smokiness. Now, it's not as smoky as an Islay whiskey like Ardbeg or like a Bullen or Lefroy or anything like that. It doesn't contain the same level of phenols as that, and there have been smokier Yoichis than this, but for me this is fine. And you definitely can smell that smokiness, but it's an accompaniment rather than a dominating presence. So I'm going to add a little bit of water to mine. Now, in previous years, This is what we're tasting, the Yuichi single malt. In previous years, you would have been able to buy 10, 12, 15, and 20-year-old variants of this, plus other older stuff. But at the moment, and this is across the board for Japanese whiskey, it's become so popular over the last 10 years particularly, that they're simply not able to keep up, or they weren't able to keep up. They hadn't made enough whiskey 10 years prior to that, or 15 years prior to that, or 20 years prior to that. And therefore, at the moment, there is a real shortage of aged Japanese whiskey stock. So most Japanese whiskey making companies, particularly those from Suntory and Nikka, are currently bottling under a non-age statement. So it doesn't contain an age statement, which gives them a little bit more flexibility as to what stock to use to vat together to create an acceptable, more than acceptable product. So this Yuichi, I think it's still around 75, 80 quid. So it's not cheap, but that's just the price that Japanese whiskey commands these days. And it was never meant to be cheaper than Scotch whiskey at all. You know, it's all about the quality. And certainly, you know, the aim of the first whiskies from Yamazaki was to produce something really good, comparable to the best Scotch whiskies. And certainly some of the best Japanese whiskies I've tasted have been right up there with any of the best whiskies I've ever tasted. All right, so I've added a little bit of water to my Yuichi. And as hoped, the water always in whiskies that contain any peated element, it tends to underline that smokiness, emphasize it. So you should be able to smell a bit more of the peat smoke coming out of there now. Really good. It's just so well balanced. You know, there's a bit of nice kind of orchard fruits, citrus, a herbal hit, but then you've got that lovely puff of smoke which just sits above it, which just helps to just knit everything together to really, really well executed and put together whiskey. I hope you like it too. I mean, my hope for anyone into whiskey is just to keep exploring and keep tasting, and never write off a distillery. Never, you know, you'll taste a whiskey from a distillery, and that whiskey might not do it for you. And a lot of people will taste it and think, okay, well, that's the distillery. Now I don't like that distillery anymore, and I'm not going to taste any more from that distillery. Entirely the wrong thing to do. Keep tasting whiskies from that distillery until you find one that you do like. Undoubtedly, you will find more than one that you like from that distillery. So always just keep tasting. Never write anyone off. Okay. Now we're kind of moving category here. And we've been drinking single malt whiskies to this point, apart from the Irish blend. We're now moving to a pair of rye whiskies, which are quite different to what we've been tasting up to now, as I say. I'm just going to put on the map of Denmark for you, because this next whiskey is from that famous whiskey making country of Denmark. Which isn't famous for making whiskey, to be fair, and you can see it just north of Germany. A really cool climate for sure. There are distilleries further north in Europe than Denmark, but we're certainly getting into colder climate territory here. But wait till you see the distillery itself. And look at that. How atmospheric is that? So, as I say, we're tasting rye whiskey now. Now, rye as a cereal is much better suited to the colder climates of Northern Europe. So, perfect for the likes of Denmark. It is really a very hardy cereal, and it's part of the reason that the first whiskies from the USA were made in the USA when the settlers arrived there would have been rye whiskies, because most of them would have arrived in the northeast states, so New York, Boston, and so on, and the surrounding environment, farmland, would have been best suited for the production of rye rather than corn or wheat, which they kind of come into their own as you move further south into the USA, into the likes of Kentucky and Mississippi and so on. So further north, rye would definitely be the preference. Now, Stauning, the Danish distillery that we're talking about here, they do produce malt whiskey as well. But I think that they feel for now the rye whiskey has matured to the point where it's much more drinkable than the single malt. And that's not to say the single malt isn't tasty as well, because they use both an unmalted barley and a unpeated barley and a peated barley variant. So, but I think they prefer their rye whiskey. That's the impression I get anyway. Now, there are a few rye whiskies from Northern Europe that are worth trying, this being one of them. And I would certainly recommend that if you like this, that you should definitely explore things like the Stork Club from Germany, and there's one or two others. But you almost have to treat, if you're not familiar with rye whiskey, you almost have to treat it as a different category altogether, because it does taste entirely different to single malt whiskey. And certainly, I think when I first started tasting rye whiskies, I didn't get it, because I thought it just tasted like off whiskey. What's going on? This doesn't taste like whiskey. And no, it doesn't. It doesn't taste like normal, or what we call normal whiskey. But the European rye whiskey tends to be not quite as full on, as spicy and peppery as the USA equivalent. And hopefully that's what we'll see in this stout. Now, this is the packaging as it was. The packaging has changed, but they weren't able to get us the new packaging in time for these tastings. So ignore the label. The new packaging is quite different actually, but it's the same name. This one is bottled at 50%. I think the new variant is slightly different. But we're going to treat this the same way. So we're going to nose it carefully at full strength and taste it at full strength, and then dilute. Yeah, so rye is apparently extremely difficult to process in terms of distillation. It's not malted barley. I think is a dream to work with in comparison to rye. It gets very, very sticky in the mashing process, and is just a pain in the arse. But those that like it would say it's definitely worth it. And I would count myself amongst those now. I've come to really enjoy rye whiskey. And this is super, super subtle rye. It's not in your face. We're going to taste an American rye whiskey after this, and you'll see what the difference is there. And certainly I would encourage you to keep a bit of this in your glass to compare to the American rye that we'll taste. So the nose doesn't really prepare you for what's to come on the palate, which is super spicy, quite a little bit peppery. some really almost like smoky fruit, like smoky pears or something like that. Really interesting stuff. So I'll try a little bit of water in there just to see what happens. Wow, yeah, it really explodes out of the glass with a little bit of water added to it. That's really interesting. There's almost like a reverse effect. So without water, there's very little on the nose, but an incredible amount of intensity on the palate. When you add water to it, I find there's incredible amount of intensity on the nose, but the palate has become slightly more subdued. It's really pungent and farmyardy, you know, you get a real kind of hit of the cereal and What do you think? Is this the first time you've tried rye whiskey? If so, do you like it? Personally, I think it's a really worthwhile and interesting style, and particularly love comparing European to American. Both perfectly valid. It's almost like New World and Old World wines. You know, New World Shiraz versus a French Côte de Rhône or Crozes-Hermitage or something that's Shiraz based or Syrah based. You know, it's the same, essentially the same variety of grape, or in this case, grain. But because of the climate, because of the topography, etc., you're going to end up with quite a different proposition altogether. But that's really good stuff. Okay, so the final whiskey we've got on today is the Pig Straight Rye 10-year-old. Now, I'm just going to pour myself a bit of this, and then I'll show you a slide about Pig. Now, the story with Pig really is quite similar to where we started with Hinch, in that there was a willingness, a desire to build a distillery, but in the meantime, you know, while you're waiting for your product to mature, what do you do? Do you make gin? Do you sell maple syrup? You know, what do you do? Do you bottle from another distillery? And these guys decided to do the same as Hinch. Let me just bring up the slide here so you can see where they are. And so you should be able to see that. So Pig is in a state called Vermont, which is next door to New York State and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. It's quite a small state, as you can see. And Vermont is the Green Mountain state, so it's very luscious. You know, in the summer and spring, it's, you know, as green as it gets. In the winter, generally get a lot of snowfall. It's quite famous and quite popular with New Yorkers and Boston dwellers to go to Vermont to ski, and it's a beautiful place. And Pig is just outside of a town called Middlebury in Vermont. Now, let me just get the next slide up so that you can see the distillery itself. So the farm was actually bought in 2007, but the distillery itself didn't you know, they didn't actually open the distilling element of it until 2015. So, you know, they're still only 5 years in. But you know, they've been bottling whiskies since 2007, essentially. So they made a decision that they wanted to make rye whiskey in this place, which is perfectly understandable because this is, you know, far north USA, and as I said earlier on, you know, the climate is very hot summers to very cold winters. very often below 0 degrees. So rye really is the perfect grain for growing in such an area. But to keep themselves kind of occupied and to help build up the business, they were able to buy really good quality aged stock from the Alberta distillery in Canada, which is one of a couple of commercial distilleries in North America, which have specialize in creating rye whiskey and selling it for white labeling, so to allow other people to bottle under their label. And so that's what they did. And this represents this 10-year-old straight rye. So it's actually distilled in Canada, but would have been matured for some of its time in Vermont. But gives you a glimpse of what Whistlepig aspire to. This is what they would like to distill, and therefore bottle once their maker's ready to be released. They're not that far off. They certainly will be. They're already bottling some of their own spirit, but obviously there's still some way before they can do a 10-year-old like this. And you can see the still really, it's just one still, a hybrid still. So it contains, you can see the pot still element at the bottom, and at the top you can see the kind of column still elements. So allowing to essentially purify to the nth degree, really, without the use of a second still. Anyway, let's give this a try. So this is bottled at 50% alcohol, and I'm trying to see what the price was. I can't remember what the price. It's not cheap. I think it's around 70 or 80 quid a bottle. But 10-year-old straight rye, that's not a bad price for that. Most straight rye you see coming out of the US would tend to be 5-6 years old. Now, with this whiskey, it would have been matured in brand new, freshly charred oak casks, American oak, obviously, and it lends a real, spiciness beyond belief. But there is also some underlying fruitier flavors in here, which is really nice to see. A lot of bourbon and rye, which I love, tends to be overwhelmingly spicy and not often have too much complexity, which I know I'll probably get shot down for. But that's not to say there aren't any complex bourbons or ryes, and I certainly think this is one of them. So having added a little bit of water to it, definitely get that spicy, slightly bitter pepperiness, which you kind of recognize from an old-fashioned or a Manhattan. Certainly, I'm tempted to go home and make a Manhattan out of that, because I think it will work really well. What do you think? Do you like it? Should we nose the two ryes together? See, for me, the Stouting is much more earthy, herbaceous, pungent, whereas the Whistlepig is more about the kind of sweet, spicy oak. That doesn't necessarily make one better than the other, just completely different. Okay, well, that pretty much is it for this tasting. Really appreciate you stopping by. Thank you for purchasing one of our tasting packs, or if you were given it, thank you to the person that gave it to you. It's very much appreciated, and we hope you've enjoyed this particular tasting. There are other tastings available online, so you can get involved in. Obviously, there's tasting packs to go along with those, so you can buy those as well on the website. But for now, I'd like to thank you once again, and see you again, hopefully in the not too distant future, particularly when we're able to do physical events again. That would be nice, wouldn't it, to actually be able to see each other in the flesh. But for now, thank you and take care. Bye-bye.